Welcome to SLiTHER number 62. I'm Kyle Grice. I'm one of the members of the Leadership Council of Ionic, and the SLiTHERs are an initiative that we created back in 2020 to basically have online discussions about various topics relevant to what we do, our teaching, our service, our research, and all sorts of other things related to academia. They've mainly been focused at for faculty, but this SLiTHER and some others have also been kind of student focused. And so today we're absolutely delighted to have three awesome inorganic chemists from PhD granting institutions. We have with us today Professor John Anderson from the University of Chicago. John's an associate professor and associate chair at University of Chicago, and he's a synthetic inorganic chemist. We also have Dr. Jenny Yang from UC Irvine. Jenny is professor of chemistry in the School of Physical Sciences at UCI. And her research focuses on clean energy and catalysis and electrochemistry. And then we have Ian Tonks, Professor Ian Tonks from the University of Minnesota. He's the associate department head and the Lloyd H. Ryerson professor in the Department of Chemistry. And his research is focused on synthetic organometallic chemistry and catalytic transformations. So today we brought we invited our panelists to come because what we wanted to talk about today is applying to PhD schools. And so, as someone who works at a primarily undergraduate institution, I've only really thought of that as when I'm helping my students to apply, but it's great to hear from folks who actually are on the other side of it. And that's why we invited our panelists today. So with that, I'll just say that we've sent out in the registration form, there was a place for people to put in questions. And so we've compiled most of the questions from that. And I'll be moderating, so I'll ask those questions. But if you have other questions, we can open it up after we kind of go through the ones that we've already got. And again, for our panelists, if there's things that pop into your mind that you think of besides what we're asking, feel free to jump in. And so the questions are we tried to group them into kind of rough areas of interest for folks. And so the first area is that people were curious about is what should a prospective PhD student look for when they're first looking for a PhD program, right? When they haven't decided, necessarily what schools they're going to apply to yet. How do they decide which schools to apply to? Or do you have any thoughts about that? John, Ian, or Jenny?
I always tell my undergraduate students to look at the faculty and their research and make sure the research interest matches with what they want to do. And it's good to have a few faculty that are of interest at each department you apply to.
That's actually a key thing that I think is something that students don't necessarily realize is you want to have more than one faculty member that you might be interested in doing research with at a given institution. Ian or John, do you have any things you want to add to that?
I guess I'll echo Jenny. You want to make sure that there's a couple folks that you would be excited, at least on paper, to do research with. You should talk to your PI and any lab mates or any friends that you have in graduate school to generate names. You can look at things like US News and World Report, but even that is not very accurate in specific sub areas. So I think you really want to talk to your peers and your PI, other professors, about what are good programs in your area. And that serves as a starting point that you can kind of whittle down to a list of maybe, 5 to 10 schools or something. The other thing that I'll throw out that I think is important is, you want to think a little bit about setting yourself up for success and being at a place where you personally think you're going to thrive, right? So if you have a support structure or you want to be near family, people have all sorts of stuff going on. Maybe you have to care for a parent or something like that. That totally matters, right? So using that to kind of geographically hone in on a place that might work for you is totally legitimate. And on the other side, if you don't have anything tying you down, it's a great time to kind of explore the country and the world. So, that stuff matters. I think the science has to guide it. You have to go someplace that you're excited. But you can make that decision at some point, after the admissions process, where you're actually going to do the science. You'll have a better idea at that point. But all that stuff factors in.
Yeah, I can echo John and Jenny on all of those things. And I wanted to make a comment about the right fit as well. It's difficult to know just on paper what's going to be the right fit for anybody. And I always encourage my students, if there's research interest, it doesn't hurt to apply. Don't count out a place because it doesn't match your, US News rankings level or particular geographic limitations or something like that. Because you never know what's the place that you're going to visit where you feel supported, where you feel like you found your community. And as John said, that's the most important thing for success is feeling like you are supported and you can do what you need to do. So I also wanted to put out a note about US News. So this is a fun thing. I'm going to turn the question back to you, Kyle.
Yeah.
Do you know what metrics are used to determine the rankings for US News Chemistry?
Absolutely not. I do not know.
John, Jenny, do you know?
But I think a big one is like they survey department chairs and ask them what's the best department and blah 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 blah. Which
Yeah,
is
it's actually 100% that survey. So they just survey random professors and ask them what the best department is. There's no metrics behind it. And so I always encourage my students to look a little bit broadly on that. As John said, though, I mean, the list isn't accurate by any means. There's probably like tiers of places, but 12 versus 14, there's no difference, for example.
10 versus 30. I mean, again, depends.
Oh, yeah.
Specific sub areas, it's just totally not accurate. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think that's a good lesson is don't rely on those rankings to limit thoughts about applying places and definitely again to kind of echo everybody's the fit and a place that you'd be happy and supported for or you feel supported for the time in grad school. Yeah. So and I think John said like 5 to 10 schools is a good kind of range of that most folks apply to. That was another question that was how many schools should someone apply to? And I think that that's a number I've heard before, that range.
The advice that I was given as an undergraduate by the late great Greg Hillhouse was you should only apply to as many schools as you're willing to visit.
Yes.
So if you can fast forward to March, if you have 10 schools that you applied to and you have visit weekends at all of them, you're going to have a pretty hectic spring. So that's a metric that one can think about.
Yeah. So that's, we're kind of, the questions are kind of organized chronologically. So the visit days are later in the year, right? Once you've been accepted. But so let's say you're looking at schools as a student and you found the schools you want to apply to. Next couple of questions relate to the application itself. And so, for example, what do you recommend students do for having folks like their PI or others look at their application materials? Or how should a student go about doing their application materials?
I think that it's important to edit early and edit often. And so what I always suggest to my students is to work with a mentor in my group. So we're at a research institution, so most of my undergraduate students are paired with a PhD student or postdoc, and they kind of iterate through the first couple drafts. But just getting someone to have a look at it ahead of time is really important. And the earlier you do it, the earlier it is to pivot as well. So if things aren't working, you can make changes very, very easily. Whereas if you try and kind of polish something off and then hand it off to your professor or someone else for feedback, oh gosh, I mean, that could be a lot of effort that kind of was put in the wrong direction or something like that.
I would second what Ian says. Get as many people look at it as possible, both the graduate students in the group and any of your research supervisors. They could, whether you did an RU or something else, have them look at it, give you advice. And I would also say, when it comes to your research statement, at least, it should be personalized to the university that you're applying to. I think some of the mistakes that people make, at least when we do admissions, is they don't say who they want to work for. And, we want to make sure all students get into groups. And so part of our mission strategy, right, is to try to make sure that we accept in areas where we need students. And if people don't say, or they say, I'll do anything or anything PCAM or something. That's not very helpful for us. So definitely have names of people that you're interested in, and then show that you've done your homework enough. For example, by not putting down someone that's like total synthesis and spectroscopy, on the same one. Just that you've looked a little bit at the department and why you want to be there.
And that's a good thing to clarify, I think, for our students is, again, I'm not even surely clear on this, is when you apply, are you applying to a specific division, or do you have to, or is it to the whole school and then you go to a division after that?
So I think all graduate applications are typically looked at by faculty members in the department, and I'm not sure how Chicago, Minnesota do it, but the people who look at your application will depend on what you put your interests are. You don't have to stay there. Like if you apply as an organic, you could switch to PCAM or something else once you get here, but it sort of dictates who looks at your application, and it helps us evaluate in the areas that we're looking for more students or things like that.
And this goes back to that comment of having 2 or 3 faculty that could be interested in, is you'd put those names in the application, which is
Yeah, and I'll mention for us, we don't have divisions at Minnesota, and so this results in some organizational chaos on our side. But what it means is that we typically are just looking for the best candidates. And if I could give you an idea of how we typically separate it out, we typically think about people as either chemists that are going to make stuff or people that are going to measure stuff. That's the level of division that we have.
Yeah, you can have, I've heard it said you can have a maker or a modeler or a measurer, right? Or you can do all 3 too. But awesome. What about the GRE? Is that, I haven't kept up with that, but I saw some schools no longer accepting that, or do you guys require it, or do you recommend students do it still?
Chicago does not require it. I forget if we even accept it. We may allow students to upload it, but we may not even allow them to upload it anymore. With that being said, I think that pendulum is still swinging, and I don't know where it's going to land in the next 5 years. To be honest, I think that, 10 years ago, there's almost certainly too much weight put on those scores, just because it's really shown that they correlate very strongly with socioeconomic status and things like that, instead of, ability, which is what one hopes to measure. But I've heard a lot of folks saying that if one calibrates for that, it's a data point, right? And if it's integrated over a number of data points, it has some merit. So currently we don't really look at it, and I don't think it's important. If I would say to students, if it has some role in the narrative that you want to write to the department, like maybe your grades weren't great in your first or second year and you want to show, yeah, but now I'm a kick-ass student, then then you can think about it in that context, but I don't think it's required or necessary by any stretch. And there's no stigma if you don't have it.
Not required at Irvine.
Yeah,
same here.
So when fit over nearly 20 years ago when I applied to grad school, it was like everybody had to do it kind of thing. Yeah. Great. And so I think we've hit on many of those types of questions for the kind of what goes into the application. And John pointed something out that I think is, like what in going into a personal statement is like the narrative about you as a student, like how, maybe you struggled, but then you overcame those struggles, and then, to show that type of narrative and make sure that it is, that it is tailored to each school. On your end, have you seen graduate admissions looking more competitive or more applications over the last several years, or have there seen any trends like that in grad applications, or have you seen expectations change over time for what you're looking for?
I'll take a stab at this. So I think the numbers of applications have gone up. I don't know if it's been like an exponential jump, but they've gone up. I think a more interesting question is whether the number of slots has stayed static while that's been going up. And I think that's very school dependent. what I'll say for Chicago, and I think other schools specifically, the unionization push, I'm treading into muddy water here, but if the cost of all students goes up by some multiple, call whatever, 1.5, right? I don't think that grants have kept up with that. So if departments have stepped up, so what that all means is I do think that there's going to be, if I had to read the tea leaves, I do think it's going to be more competitive going into the future. With that being said, I don't know that I've seen that crunch immediately at Chicago as of yet, but there's just so much variation year to year. I think we need like a 5-year average to really see if the admissions percentage is going down. So long story short is I don't know that there's firm data to support that it's getting more competitive, but if you ask me, I think over the next few years, it probably will be a little bit more. I think it's okay that was recorded, but maybe I'm not. Sorry, Jenny, go ahead.
We can have more frank discussion if we want to after the recording, if we want to.
I'll echo John's comments on that front too. For us, I think that right now our slots are pretty steady and applications have gone up. But the question of has it gotten more competitive is actually a really interesting one. And I would say that, although our applications have gone up, the number of people that I think are like highly qualified for a PhD program has actually stayed kind of steady. So.
Speaking of highly qualified, like for things that a school would look for in applicants is like having a good narrative that's tailored to the school. Research experience certainly, right, is probably a big positive. And so or in terms of things that could strengthen a student's application, what are the main things that a student could do? If you're trying to give student advice to say maybe a junior or a sophomore thinking about applying in their senior year, what's some advice that you might give those students for things that they could do in the next couple of years to strengthen their application?
I think the number one really is getting meaningful research experience. Mm-hmm. And if you can do it outside of your home institution, that's all the better, just because it gives admissions committees another data point for you, right? So, everyone at DePaul loves you, but then also you did this internship at a company and they liked you too. And why is that important for us? It shows that you can be successful in different environments, right? So you're adapting, you're learning on the fly, and you can be successful there. That's by no means a requirement, but it certainly helps a lot. Right? So.
Yeah, those first, for the students, that's if research on your home institution is good, but ways of getting doing research elsewhere. There's things called REUs that many schools do, which is a research experience for undergraduates over the summer. So you can go to a school nearby or even far away and do research for the summer and get a stipend and housing usually, and get some more research experience, and that becomes something that can go into your application, and also that person, your PI from that place could be a letter writer.
Yeah, and there's a large, I think, national dialogue about equity in terms of research opportunities as well. And so this is something that I think most schools factor in as well. Not everyone is going to have the opportunity to go external. And so I think that there's a lot of ways to kind of satisfy, a quote unquote requirement of research experience and getting a diversity of experiences that may not be, doing an REU at some other school as well. So again, I think it all kind of fits into the narrative of your story. How are you kind of being ambitious, and how are you kind of taking control of your own research education? I think that's the important part.
Yeah, I'll maybe just echo and slightly pivot off that too, which is to say, when we're evaluating students for a graduate program, you're signing up to do 5 years or whatever of like intense research, right? You're going to wake up, you're going to eat, sleep, and breathe that research project. And I think the single most important thing for success in graduate school, I mean, there's many, many important things, right? But scientifically, you have to be just fascinated with that process and engaging in research. And it's really hard to know whether you love research if you haven't done it, right? So it's really important frankly, for yourself to know research is hard, right? Like, like if you're in the MLB and you miss 70% of your at-bats, right, then you're doing great. And if you're in science, if you're batting 300 in your experiments, you're like, the best that there ever was, right? I mean, our success rate, because we're trying things that have never been done before, is super, super low. And you just need to know that and love the process and the grind. And it's important to, you really find that out when you've got a project in the lab. So I think that's an important experience, frankly, for being competitive for applications, but also for knowing if grad school is a good fit.
Yeah.
I'm going to add one more thing before we. Oh, sorry, Kyle. Did you want to?
No, go ahead.
Just before we move on to any other topic, about what Ian said is I second also the getting another letter by doing research elsewhere if you're able to. And what I always tell my students, because I teach in the fall, is that, in November, December, that's the time we start thinking about next summer because most of these deadlines will be January, February, March, the latest. And so if you're like in April going, oh, I want to go do something this summer, it might be too late. So do that research early on summer programs. There's the RU program that Kyle mentioned is great. There's also Department of Energy. There's the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Association. There's a German program called DADD that also my undergrads have gone to. So you just have to start thinking about it like in the fall, basically, for next summer.
Yeah, you can also go work at national labs like the DOE and stuff. And I want to say it's called SULI, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, it is too late. Yeah, and that one is due, I think, early January. So you have to get on that if you want to do it.
Yeah. And so in terms of the research that a student is doing, does it matter necessarily that if they haven't been able to do the research that the type, like let's say, synthesis, right? And they want to go do synthesis in grad school, does it matter that if they haven't been able to do that, they have done some research, right?
I would say no, right? Like, I love it, of course, like if a student comes and wants to do research with me and they've like done air-free synthesis as an undergrad, of course, that's great, right? But that's a pretty small slice of the pie. I think in a generic sense, like I said, the process of research is engaging in a hard problem at a high level, being rigorous, keeping notes, problem solving. Those are all the skills that I think you look for that are really vital in whatever project you're going to take. So I think that, there are lots of folks that find an area that they like as an undergraduate, and then there's lots that pivot in graduate school or pivot as a postdoc or pivot if they go off into a national lab or an academic career or whatever, right? So I think that you shouldn't get too hung up about being tied in or wedded to an area based on what you pick as an undergraduate. There are definite pivot points, and I think it's true. And Jenny and Ian can tell me if I'm wrong, but at Chicago, and I think almost all U.S. institutions, you are not tied to any research group or any specific area when you're admitted. You're admitted to the program, and then you have chances over the summer and the first kind of term of study to shop around and see if you want to switch areas and think about a different research group. You have that freedom. So I think there's only opening doors as you go along. There's not closed ones by making a choice.
Great. So we're some folks have been put some questions in the chat, but we're almost done with kind of the pre-submitted questions. So I want to go through that first, and then we can see what else is in the chat. So just a couple things left here. So one question is when or is it good to email a lab that someone's interested in working for? Should they email PIs individually or contacting the lab ahead of time before applying to a program? And just as a side note, it's hilarious because I get emails all the time from international students asking to join my PhD program, and I don't have a PhD program. And so I think part of that is in other countries, the system works where you actually apply to a professor individually instead of to a program like in the US.
Yeah, I can take a first stab at this. So I get a lot of emails from students that essentially ask like, "Hey, Professor Tonks, I'm interested in applying to Minnesota. Are you taking students?" And the answer is always yes. Like, we run research, like active research programs and everything like that. And so, that's not really like an email that's going to like get you the edge or something like that. Most of us are actually not involved in admissions, right? So we have a team of like 6 people. So if you want to contact a PI kind of like pre-admissions period, I think it's better to do that in terms of doing it as fact finding for yourself rather than trying to treat it as a strategy to increase your chance of success for admissions. So, if you read a paper from a PI and you're like genuinely interested in it, or you want to learn more because you think you might be, then it's okay to be like, hey, Professor Tonks, or Ian's fine, right? I'm really excited about this paper that you published on whatever topic. Like, are you guys still working on that? And what can you explain some aspects of this to me? Like, that's a much more exciting email that I think will get you more. So, but I don't like forward that on to the admissions committee, being like, hey, this person's interested, right? So they won't listen to me anyway.
I'll echo that. A lot of times when a paper's been published a year or two ago, that may seem kind of like a recent thing, but with the pace of research, a lot of times in labs, that might be old news, right? Or maybe that project is morphed into a very different direction. So actually, yeah, I agree with Ian. Yes, we're always taking students. So that question, we get it a lot. I think that was like the advice 3 years ago, is to make sure that they're taking students, which is fine. But I think a much better question is, hey, like, this was cool. Are you still working on this? How has this project evolved since this paper came out? And we're very vain creatures. So we love it if anyone's interested in our esoteric little project. So
Yeah. So yeah, these are great. I think the one, and this kind of again ties back to that having multiple people thing, because um, it is a fact finding, as Ian said, like as a fact finding things, you can tell you if they're still, if someone's an assistant professor, an associate professor, or a relatively young professor, like they're still going to have active research groups. But there are some folks who are, towards retirement age, and like I may actually retire the next year. And so I think I had that happen to me where I was looking at a school and I had like 3 people that I wanted to work with, and one of them turned out to be retiring that year. And so, which I didn't know until I asked, right? But it's then again another reason why it's good to have multiple people that you're interested in at an institution. And then um, the kind of like the follow up to that question was like, should someone contact graduate students or postdocs, you know, about like applying or to getting advice to applying to school or things like that, rather than a PI.
I think that the advice that you're going to get from grad students and postdocs is probably going to be pretty heterogeneous. And so kind of like cold emailing someone in a lab is probably not going to be a particularly effective strategy. But, if you have an alumni from your school or some of their connection, that's a really good person to potentially contact and be like, hey, I saw you graduated from my university 3 years ago. What was the admissions process like for you? Like, how does this compare to our home institution? Things like that. Like, that can be a really powerful connection, I think.
Yeah. And then the alumni also know kind of like what it's like to be at the current undergrad institution, so they have that commonality with you. That's a great piece of advice.
I think the one thing I'd want to add to that though with the students is that they have a better picture of the student life, and I think that's an okay thing to ask about. I know people ask my students about this. And also just sort of add on to what John was saying about not being admitted to work for a specific professor. Another good question to ask is whether a program has rotations or not, right? Because there are a few programs in the US where you have to commit very early, even after you're admitted, right, to a faculty member. And so you just want to get more information if you think you might want to try other types of science, is to ask whether they have rotations. And I saw a question on the list, sorry, I'll jump ahead about um, like cost of living considerations and things. And so that's another good thing to ask graduate students about as well, because they can give you a better picture of what it's like to live in the area. Or, if it's a fun place to be in your 20s or something. So these are the kind of things that they can help you with.
Yeah, and that's kind of the last set of the early submitted questions was, thinking
If I
about.
could follow up on that one before we get
Yeah,
to
go
it,
ahead.
just because I'd be curious to hear John and Jenny's take on this too. So, I typically advise my students to wait on those types of questions until they've been admitted to a program. And so to apply relatively broadly and then go there and start to ask these types of questions, just because at the end of the day, we all have different experiences and we view things through different lenses. And so, I've had people that visited a school or attended a school and found it to be a horrible experience, and then others that had a great time. And so this is my case for my PhD. I had a lovely time in my PhD, but then I was surprised to learn, because I'm pretty dense, that other people weren't having a great time. And so it's just very different depending on everyone's personality.
Yeah, and that's
so to echo that, or maybe to try to merge what Jenny and Ian are saying, a great way actually is to contact the PI, get their opinion, and then you can ask them, are there any students in your lab that I could talk to about what your group is like and stuff like that? And I think, frankly, if they're not willing to let you talk to a student, that's a red flag. Most PIs will have, maybe there's a sub area of the lab that you're interested in. They'll just get you in contact with those students, and you can ask about the project and other things like that. So that's maybe a medium ground but I do agree with you. You can ask, there's plenty of points to ask that. You're not committing to a school at the application point. One other pitch that I'll make, and this may be, I don't know how general this is, but when you apply, many schools will have an application fee waiver, and there are different hoops that you may or may not have to jump through to get that waiver. But I think it's a great thing to ask for, because it's a racket that you have to pay whatever it is, 80 or $100 to apply. For full disclosure, at least at Chicago, the department does not see any of that money. It disappears into some administrative bucket that we never see. So we love to hand out application fee waivers at the department level, because it costs us nothing. And there's certain things we have to do that. But faculty, I think, are generally enthusiastic to either help you directly or get you in contact with someone that can help you navigate that process. So don't be shy about saying, hey, by the way, I'd rather not drop $100 on this application. Do you have any fee waiver process or anything that I can engage in? And most schools have some mechanism for that.
Yeah. So application fee waivers through the own school. And also another thing I just want to mention quickly is at your home institution, many schools have things like offices of student success, or kind of like focused on graduate school, or some like groups that support minority students might have funds to be able to cover some of those costs for paying for the application. So check at your own home institution too, to see if there's ways you can cover those fees.
I'll add something for the UC system, is that all of the fee waivers requests have to be submitted by December 1st, which is when applications are getting due. So you have to do it ahead of time. So just look on the websites, and they'll have information, and make sure you get those dates right, so that you can get everything in before their deadline.
Yeah. And so this last kind of couple questions that prepared is like kind of more financial stuff. And like, so some of the stuff was already mentioned, right? So, cost of the thing, but then also, the cost of living, where you're going to be. And that's, again, as I think Ian or John said, that's something you do more after you've already gotten in. You go visit and ask grad students, and ask, the folks who are there, what they do and how they live and where they live. And so, like, if you have any thoughts about how students can kind of learn about that, or think about ways of, addressing that, when they're doing their visits, or thinking about which school they're going to accept.
I wanted to add something because of the way the question was phrased. Is a lot of my students at UCI who are first generation college students don't know graduate school is paid for. So you don't have to pay tuition. You're getting a stipend to live off of. So the vast majority of students are fully, in fact, almost all programs will guarantee support for 5 years or some extent, period of time. So graduate school, people don't finish their PhDs like med students or business students, or, where they have like a load of student debt. Everything is covered. The stipend is enough to live off of. So I just wanted to make that clear, that you should be applying to programs that are fully funded, which is like the vast majority of them.
Yeah, I'll echo that. It's not glamorous pay, but you get paid to do your PhD. It's a pretty sweet deal. And yeah, I mean, you can ask questions about cost of living in a particular area, and what the stipend is versus that cost of living. And maybe you're like, I was married in graduate school, so I had a built-in roommate, which was nice and saved some money. And maybe you do or don't have something like that. So those are all fair considerations, right? But don't want to sound crude, but every serious graduate program that you would apply to in the United States is going to pay you a stipend that is meant to be a livable stipend in that area. And there's always shades of more or less livable that you can think about, but on principle, every serious grad program provides you a livable stipend.
Yeah, that should be emphasized. And like you're not going to save up a whole bunch of money, but you're not going to need to take out loans either. And you'll be able to pay rent and live.
Yeah, I think importantly there too, insurance and other benefits are part of that package as well. Right?
Yep. Yep.
In terms of speaking of this financial aid and the coverage of that, most schools, and correct me if I'm wrong, like you TA in exchange for that stipend, right?
Depends. I think that every school is a little bit different in how they structure that. I think a common model is that you teach during your first year. I think that's fairly common across schools. And then after that, a lot of times you're supported by a mix of TA and research funds. And the amount of TAing you do is dependent on a lot of things, how much money your PI has, if there's fellowships and things, either internal or external that you have, as well as how much you want to TA, right? Some students want to go into education and they want that teaching experience. And that could be an upper level lecture class or a lab class. So I think it's very heterogeneous into how much or how little you do. And you have at least some say in that, right? I think there's a dialogue between you and your PI in the department about how much TAing you do or don't do. So it depends is the short answer.
And I do want to mention there's one thing that's due soon called the NSF GRFP, which is a fellowship that you can apply for, that students can apply for either in their senior year, the year they're applying to graduate schools, or the first year of graduate school, I think.
They can actually do both. So the rule now is that you can't apply twice in graduate school, but I always encourage my undergrads to try as a senior because it's an extra shot, basically. Yeah.
You give up 50% of your tries if you don't apply as an undergraduate.
Yep.
And so that's due October 15th, so it's coming up quick. And the letters, I think, are due October 11th for your letter writers. So
they sure are.
So I wanted to mention that if you get it, is again like it pays. You might actually get a little more than the standard stipend, but you wouldn't have to TA because you'd be funded through that. All right, I think that's all we've hit on most of the submitted questions from before, and so there's now just kind of questions in the chat, either directly to me or to the group, and so I'm just going to go through these. They might kind of be at different points of this and not in chronological order. So we talked already about getting relevant and reliable information from grad students and postdocs about life, and then getting information for the PIs. How much weight does admissions committees place on the undergraduate school that students come from? Does that factor in, or is it more about the kind of the whole package?
I could just start saying it doesn't matter to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that it plays a really critical role. Yeah. So research experience, if you've gone, I think if you haven't done any research experience or something and you're at a really famous school, that's a huge red flag. And conversely, if you're at maybe a less well-known or a smaller school or something, but you've really done an awesome job with your undergrad thesis or whatever, that speaks much more. So I think it's not a big factor.
Yeah. And this kind of goes back to also letter writers. Make sure your letter writers can talk about, your research experience or your experience that would show that you could be successful. You will be successful in graduate school. There was someone, let's hear it. Next one was, and we talked about that. So we talked about the GRE. If the GRE is listed as recommended, should a student take it? Do you think? Probably, yeah. So if it's recommended for a school, probably take it, but many schools don't require it.
Right.
We already talked about if the field or subfield if the student's done research in is different than where they want to go into, that's fine. So maybe the next question was recommendations on how to choose letter writers. Who would you want? Who should a student think about when because usually is it 3 letters or
Pretty standard, yeah.
pretty standard, it's 3 letters. What types of folks should they have write a letter for them?
I think the people that know you best is the most important thing. Um, at least one of those should be able to speak to your research abilities. That's incredibly important. And it would certainly be a red flag if you'd been doing research in a lab and you didn't have any letter from that person.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously there could be reasons why that would be the case, but we would have to do more digging into
I
it.
think it's okay to say that if that's if
Yeah.
you had a really bad experience or relationship with that, just say it in your statement and
Personal
say, I did this, I learned some cool things, but it was not really the right place for me. And
Yeah.
then we won't worry about it so much, especially if there's other, sort of, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and it's okay to have auxiliary letters from like a coach from a team or something like that. Particularly if it speaks, and you can coach your letter writers too, particularly if it speaks to things like perseverance and your ability to grind through problems and so on. So like that, those sorts of things are fine. Like Ian said, I don't think that should be your only type of letter, right? You want someone to talk about how your academic and intellectual capabilities and in your research experience specifically, but it does not hurt to have a letter that says, oh, this person was, the glue that held together this project I was working with them on or something, that can be an effective letter.
Yeah, I want to jump off of something that John said too about coaching your letter writers. That's a good idea. So actually having a conversation with your letter writer about your own personal narrative and what you're trying to kind of put forward is really valuable. At all stages, actually. I mean, I still do that as a professor. So if I have to get a rec letter for something, I usually talk to the rec letter writer and I'm like, hey, Jenny, I need a rec letter for this. Like, would you be able to talk about, how good at NMR I am or something like that? Right?
Yep, yep.
It can be
And,
really
and
beneficial.
And as part of that, you should send any like GRFPs coming up, and if you ask someone, just send them your materials that you're going to submit. Right. This comes back to the edit early and often that Ian said. This gives them a chance to give you feedback potentially, but it also gives them material to put into their letter that they can comment on that directly supports what you're saying in your application material. So I think the more you can help your letter writers, the better of a letter they will write.
That's a great point. And so when I write letters for my own students, I always ask them to send me a resume or CV so I can try to put things in context beyond what I know about them from a class, for example. Yeah, we don't want to keep you folks for too much longer, but there's just a couple more questions. So one person asked, how do I express that I've done how does someone say in their cover letter, like that they're interested in someone's group and know, like they've looked into it? Do they, you say like, do they just need to say like, I'm interested in so-and-so, 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 or do they need to like spend a lot of time talking about that in the cover
So that's a great question. And I think it goes into the personal statement part, and specifically talking about a research group. And if you can write intelligently about someone's research program beyond just like, I like John Anderson's work, insert thing that I copied and pasted from his website research summary. That's, I think, really helpful. So if you can go in and say, for example, oh, like, I really like Professor Anderson's research. Like I saw that he published these papers on these cobalt oxos. And one of the things that really fascinated me was, the ability to go in there and use EPR spectroscopy and other tools to really understand the electronic structure, right? Saying something like that, it tells me that you are interested and it tells me that you're willing to kind of go a little bit beyond.
Ian, I think you just got admitted to University of Chicago. It's like,
Well, Ian, there's a spot for you whenever you want it. I don't think you want it, but there's a spot for you.
yeah.
You don't want me. I'm a terrible synthetic chemist at this stage.
Oh, yeah, well,
in 10 years.
We're all going downhill in that regard. That's true. That's true.
I just want to second what Ian said because we have when I look at inorganic applications for the most part, and we sort of have a joke about how people will sometimes write like, I'm interested in Blum, Borovic, and Evans, but no, just those names because those are the first three that come up when you hit inorganic division because they're in alphabetical order. So I definitely agree that just putting names out is not enough. You should say a little bit more about why.
And that goes back to doing looking at schools, looking at the people at the schools, doing some research on them, as part of the application process.
Yeah, and we're savvy people. We kind of know what we're working on in our groups. And so just trying to cut and paste just won't go very well either. In fact, that can be like a little bit of a turnoff, I think. So
We're savvy and we also don't update our websites as frequently as we should. So that may not
exactly.
be accurate.
Yeah, Google Scholar might be the way to go then. Just really quickly about the NSF GRFP. If someone asked if someone's taking a gap year before grad school, can they still apply for it?
I think so, yeah. I think you can apply as an undergraduate and you can defer that by a year. So I think it's fine to apply as an undergraduate, even if you're going to take a gap year.
Okay.
It becomes a little tricky if you're doing like a joint BS, MS, or a 4+1 or something, because as soon as you are registered as anything other than a bachelor's level student and you apply, that uses your graduate application. So I won't claim to be an expert on that. People should talk to like a GRFP person to check on eligibility. But if you're just doing a BS, taking a gap year, I think you can apply and then apply again as a graduate student even after the gap year.
And then, so for our attendees, today we do have a evaluation form. I just put in the chat, that Chip Notaro put in the chat. And so if you have an idea for another panel of folks or another topic for a SLiTHER, we always love taking ideas from the community. But let's do, I want to keep folks for another 5 more minutes maybe here. So the last couple of questions, one person was curious if when you're having the letter writers, should they be from people who have PhDs? Or what does it hurt to have letters from non-PhD folks?
I don't think it hurts to have letters from non-PhD folks. It might hurt a little bit if you have only letters from non-PhD folks, right? I think some selection of letters from a variety of folks is totally fine. But if you have again, if you're going into research and you have a letter from your boss at this job, your sports coach, and, a counselor at the college or something like that, that doesn't speak at all to research, that's going to be a red flag. So it doesn't have to be exclusively PhD people by any means, but I think having one person that can really talk to research stuff is valuable.
Right. And some of these questions I think we already hit on, so I'm trying to skip over that. But yeah, I think scrolling through here, sorry. One question that we didn't get yet was, do you have any different or additional advice for non-US applicants? So if someone's like an international student and wants to apply to a US-based program, are things specifically different, or is it just the same application, same approach?
It's going to be school dependent, and I'll go out on a limb and say, I guess private schools don't care. Public schools, and I'm not sure this is true in the UC system. International students are not allowed to apply for California residency. So Berkeley has done this forever, where they just waive that. The university waives the extra funding that's required for international students. UCI started doing that 6 years ago, which has been fantastic. So it's basically now it doesn't matter. But for some state schools, it can matter. So it's worth asking.
Yeah. So
I think most of the UCs now waive the non-resident tuition, but it's
Yeah, thank goodness that that's finally coming online. I mean, talk about a really big piece of inequity, right? I will mention that especially in public schools, one of the ways that we support our students early on before they join their research group is through TA positions. And so we do have language requirements for that are pretty, hard and fast. So we can bend the rules a little bit, but not a lot. And so you have to take the tested English language as a foreign language, or tested English as a foreign language exam, and get a certain score on it. And it's worth reaching out to a school and saying like, hey, is this language score meeting the criteria for you all? Like I would happily tell people yes or no. Because like, what a waste, if you put in an application and it's just money down the drain because you're not eligible to teach, right? We can't accept those students. The university won't let us, even if they're amazing,
Yeah.
which is
So,
frustrating.
so
Yeah, that's true at UChicago too. There's a TOEFL requirement for international students, which, yeah, again, we can talk about inequities and things, but that is a requirement. And yeah, I'll echo what Kyle said. A big difference is I think in a lot of countries you apply directly to a PI, and I get tons of emails from international students saying like, will you accept me into your group? And I have a stock response, which is the department admits students to the program, and you have to apply through this portal. So that's a big difference from the international application process.
Well, I don't want to keep you folks for much any longer. So, thank you to everybody who came out, and thank you especially to John, Ian, and Jenny for being our wonderful panelists. And this video will be, take us a few days, but we'll get it up onto our SLiTHER collection. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody, remind everybody to do the really short evaluation feedback form that Chip posted in the chat, and we will see you in the future.